The horrors of flak crews in WW2. The 16-year-old boy's hands were shaking so badly he could barely load the shell into the breech. Above him, the sky was filled with the thunderous roar of hundreds of American B-17 bombers, their formations stretching from horizon to horizon like a plague of mechanical locusts. His sergeant screamed something at him, but the words were lost in the deafening cacophony of their own 88mm gun firing, the sound so violent it felt like being punched in the chest by an invisible fist. The gun recoiled, the breech opened, and the spent shell casing ejected with a hiss of superheated metal. He had 3 seconds to load the next round. 3 seconds before the sergeant would beat him. 3 seconds before the bombers overhead would drop their payload and potentially end his life. This was the reality of being a flak crew member in World War II, a nightmare that has been largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by the stories of pilots and ground troops. But make no mistake, what these young men endured was nothing short of hell on earth. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of World War II and want to hear more deep dives into the experiences that history often overlooks, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. The German word Flak is an abbreviation of Flugabwehrkanone, which translates to flight defense cannon or anti-aircraft gun. To the Allied bomber crews who flew through curtains of exploding steel over German cities, flak was a terrifying phenomenon, black puffs of smoke that appeared without warning, each one capable of tearing an aircraft apart. But to the young men who manned these weapons, flak represented something entirely different. It was their prison, their torture chamber, and for many, their tomb. These weren't hardened warriors or volunteers filled with ideological fervor. By 1943, the majority of flak crews were teenagers, some as young as 15, along with old men in their 50s and 60s who had been deemed unfit for frontline infantry service. They were the desperately scraped bottom of the barrel, thrown into one of the most dangerous jobs of the entire war. Let me tell you about Hans Müller, a composite character based on numerous accounts from survivors. Hans was 17 when he was assigned to a flak battery on the outskirts of Hamburg in early 1943. He had been in the Hitler Youth, as all German boys were required to be, but he had no military training beyond marching in parades and learning to read maps. His father was fighting on the Eastern Front. His older brother had been killed at Stalingrad, and his mother worked 12 hours a day in a munitions factory. Hans reported to his battery commander, a grizzled First World War veteran named Hauptmann Fischer, who looked at the boy with a mixture of pity and resignation. Fischer had been commanding flak batteries since 1940, and he had watched the quality of his crews deteriorate with each passing year as the war consumed Germany's young men. He knew that boys like Hans had perhaps a 30% chance of surviving more than 6 months in this assignment. The flak battery where Hans was stationed consisted of 4 88mm guns arranged in a square formation, surrounded by sandbags and camouflage netting. The 88mm flak gun was a marvel of German engineering, a weapon so versatile it was used against aircraft, tanks, and fortifications with devastating effect. It could fire a shell weighing nearly 20 pounds to an altitude of over 26,000 feet, and its rate of fire in the hands of a well-trained crew could reach 15 to 20 rounds per minute. But there was nothing glorious about operating one. Each gun required a crew of 10 men to function at peak efficiency, and every role was both physically demanding and incredibly dangerous. Hans was assigned as a loader, which meant his job was to take 40-pound shells from the ammunition bunker, carry them to the gun, and ram them into the breech while the gun was being continuously aimed and fired. The first time Hans experienced combat was during a daylight raid by American B-17s. The air raid sirens began wailing at 11:47 in the morning, their undulating scream cutting through the normal sounds of the city. The crews scrambled to their positions, and Hans felt his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The sky was clear, a beautiful spring day, which meant the bombers would have perfect visibility for their attack. Within minutes, the spotters called out the approaching formations. Hans looked up and saw them, tiny silver specks that caught the sunlight, arranged in their characteristic box formations that provided mutual defensive fire. There were hundreds of them. The battery commander began shouting coordinates. The gun crews spun their wheels to adjust elevation and azimuth, and then the order came to fire. The first shot was the worst. Hans had been told about the noise, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality. The 88mm gun fired with a concussion that felt like it collapsed his lungs. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt in every cell of his body, a physical assault that left his ears ringing and his vision momentarily blurred. The gun recoiled violently on its mount. The breech opened automatically, and the spent shell casing was ejected with a metallic clang and a hiss of hot gas. "Load!" screamed the gun commander, and Hans grabbed the next shell from the ready rack. His hands trembling, his muscles already burning from the weight. He rammed it home, the breech closed, and the gun fired again, and again, and again. The rhythm became mechanical, repetitive, a nightmare loop of grab, lift, load, cover ears, feel the concussion, repeat. After 15 minutes of continuous firing, Hans's hands were bleeding from friction burns where the shells had scraped against his skin. His ears were ringing so loudly he could barely hear the commands being shouted at him. His shoulders and back screamed in agony from the constant lifting of 40-pound shells. And above them, the bombers flew on, seemingly untouched by the storm of steel being thrown into the sky. The flak crews were firing at such high altitude that they couldn't see if they were hitting anything. They aimed at mathematical coordinates, adjusted for wind and speed, and hoped that somewhere up in that blue sky, their shells were finding their marks. Sometimes they saw a bomber trailing smoke or falling from formation, and a ragged cheer would go up from the crews. But most of the time, they had no idea if they were accomplishing anything at all. Then came the moment every flak crew dreaded. The bombers reached their release point and their bomb bay doors opened. From the ground, it looked almost beautiful in a terrible way. Small black objects tumbling from the bellies of the aircraft, catching the light as they fell. The gun commander screamed for everyone to take cover, and Hans threw himself into the nearest slit trench, pressing his body against the earth as tightly as he could. The first bombs hit about 300 meters away, and the ground heaved like a living thing. The sound was beyond description, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself, a deep bass rumble punctuated by the sharper cracks of individual explosions. The concussion waves rolled over them, sucking the air from their lungs, filling their mouths with dirt and dust. Hans pressed his hands over his ears and squeezed his eyes shut, and he prayed in a way he had never prayed before. Not the rote prayers he had learned as a child, but desperate, animal pleas for survival. The bombing lasted 11 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the all-clear finally sounded, Hans climbed out of the trench on shaking legs. One of the 4 guns in their battery had taken a direct hit. The weapon was destroyed, twisted metal and shattered sandbags, and of the 10-man crew, only 2 survived, both so badly wounded they would never serve again. The other men were simply gone, vaporized by the explosion, or blown into pieces too small to identify. Hans vomited into the dirt, his body rebelling against the horror his eyes had witnessed. The sergeant grabbed him by the collar and shook him. "No time for that," the man snarled. "We've got wounded to care for, and a gun position to clear. Move!" This was the reality of flak crews. They were expected to shoot at bombers flying overhead, while those same bombers dropped tons of high explosives directly on their positions. They were simultaneously attacking and being attacked, with no shelter, no armor, no protection beyond sandbags and camouflage netting. The casualty rates for flak crews were staggering, though exact figures are difficult to determine because German record-keeping broke down as the war progressed. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 50,000 flak crew members were killed during the war, with tens of thousands more wounded, many permanently disabled. But these numbers don't capture the full horror, because they don't account for the psychological casualties, the young men who survived physically but were destroyed mentally by the relentless trauma. The crews who manned the Flak batteries in the Ruhr Valley, Hamburg, Berlin, and other major industrial cities experienced some of the worst of it. These cities were targeted again and again by Allied bombing campaigns, sometimes multiple times in a single week. The crews had no rotation, no leave, no respite. They lived at their gun positions, sleeping in bunkers when they could, always on alert for the next raid. Let me tell you what a typical day was like for Hans after he had been in the battery for 3 months. He woke at dawn in the underground bunker, a concrete structure that was damp, cold, and smelled of unwashed bodies and mildew. Breakfast was ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and a slice of black bread with a scraping of margarine. The quality of food had been declining steadily, and by 1943, the rations for Flak crews were barely sufficient to sustain men doing heavy physical labor. After breakfast, there were drills. The gun had to be maintained, cleaned, and tested. Ammunition had to be moved from the main magazine to the ready positions. The rangefinders and predictors had to be calibrated. The camouflage netting had to be checked and repaired. Every aspect of the battery's operation required constant attention because their lives depended on the equipment functioning perfectly under combat conditions. Around mid-morning, the sirens wailed again. Another raid was coming. The crews rushed to their positions and Hans took his place by the ammunition-ready rack. The ritual began again. Spotters calling out coordinates, guns traversing to their firing positions, the command to fire, the deafening concussion, the mechanical rhythm of loading and firing, until his body moved on pure muscle memory and his mind retreated to some protected space deep inside where the horror couldn't quite reach. This raid lasted longer than the previous ones, nearly 40 minutes of continuous firing. Hans's hands were blistered and bleeding. His ears had long since stopped registering individual sounds and now just transmitted a constant high-pitched whine. His muscles were on fire, and his lungs burned from the acrid smoke and cordite fumes that hung over the gun position like a toxic cloud. When the bombers finally passed and the all-clear sounded, the crew assessment began. Miraculously, their gun had not been hit, though bombs had landed close enough to shower them with dirt and debris. But the battery to their east had been destroyed. 38 men killed in an instant. Hans and his crew were ordered to assist with the recovery of bodies, a task that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What they found in the rubble wasn't bodies in any conventional sense. They found pieces, fragments, scraps of uniform cloth with meat attached, boots with feet still inside them, a torso with no limbs or head, things that had once been human beings but were now just biological debris scattered across a cratered landscape. They collected what they could find in canvas bags, and Hans tried to make his mind go blank, tried to think of these fragments as something other than what they were. But the smell and the texture and the terrible weight of it all seeped into his consciousness and stayed there. That night, Hans lay in his bunk and couldn't sleep. His body was exhausted beyond measure, but his mind raced with images he couldn't control. He could hear some of the other young men crying quietly in the darkness. The older men, the veterans, lay silent and still, but Hans suspected they weren't sleeping either. They had just learned to suffer in silence. The psychological toll on Flak crews was immense and largely unaddressed. There was no concept of combat stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, no counseling or mental health support. The men were simply expected to endure, and those who broke down were often treated as cowards or malingerers. Some young men shot themselves rather than face another day at the guns. Others deserted, though desertion in Nazi Germany carried a death sentence if caught. Most simply endured, becoming hollow-eyed shadows of themselves, going through the motions of survival because there was no alternative. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was particularly brutal for Flak crews in Germany. The Allied bombing campaign intensified, with the Americans bombing by day and the British by night, giving the German defenses no rest. Hans's battery was now down to 3 guns and crews that were barely at half strength. Replacements arrived, but they were increasingly poorly trained. Some had received only 2 weeks of instruction before being sent to active batteries. These inexperienced crew members made mistakes that cost lives. One boy, even younger than Hans, panicked during a raid and ran from his position. He was cut down by shrapnel from a bomb that landed 30 meters away. His body lay in the open for 2 hours before they could retrieve it because the bombing continued. The cold was its own form of torture. The guns had to be kept operational regardless of weather, which meant the crews were exposed to the elements during their shifts. Frostbite was common. Hans watched as one of his fellow loaders lost 3 fingers to frostbite after a particularly brutal night raid where they had been at their positions for 6 straight hours in sub-zero temperatures. The man was sent to a field hospital, and Hans never saw him again. The replacement, who arrived a week later, was 56 years old, a man who had fought in the First World War and had been pulled from retirement to serve. He was strong but slow, and the physical demands of loading the gun left him gasping and pale. Hans wondered how long the old man would last. As 1944 progressed and the Allied advance continued, the strategic situation for Germany became increasingly desperate, and this was reflected in the orders given to flak batteries. They were instructed to fire more aggressively, to expose themselves more, to take greater risks to bring down Allied bombers. The logic was that each bomber destroyed meant 60 tons of bombs that wouldn't fall on German cities and factories, meant 10 highly trained American or British aircrew killed or captured, meant 1 less enemy aircraft to face. But for the flak crews, these orders meant increased exposure to counter-battery fire and bombing. The Allies had become very good at identifying and targeting flak positions. Bombers would deliberately drop some of their ordnance on the gun positions, and fighter bombers would strafe them with machine gun fire during their approach runs. Hans experienced his first strafing attack on a clear morning in April 1944. The raid had just ended, and the crews were beginning to emerge from their shelters when someone spotted the fighters coming in low and fast. They were American P-47 Thunderbolts, heavily armed fighter bombers that had apparently stayed behind after escorting the bomber formation. They came in at treetop level, their engines roaring, and then their guns began firing. The sound was like giant canvas being ripped apart, a buzzing roar that grew louder and louder. Hans threw himself flat as the rounds stitched across the gun position, kicking up geysers of dirt and ricocheting off the metal gun shield with sounds like hammers striking anvils. 1 round hit the ammunition-ready rack and the shell exploded, killing 2 men instantly and wounding 4 others. Hans felt something hot pass over his back, so close he could feel the heat through his uniform, and then the fighters were gone, climbing away into the sky. When he stood up, his legs wouldn't stop shaking. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cool spring air. 3 men were dead, 5 wounded, and the gun position was a mess of scattered ammunition and damaged equipment. They spent the rest of the day cleaning up, treating the wounded, and repairing what could be repaired. That night, an officer from division headquarters visited and delivered a speech about duty and sacrifice and the importance of their mission. Hans barely heard the words. He was thinking about the fragment of shrapnel he had found embedded in his pack, a piece of jagged metal that had come within inches of severing his spine. He thought about how random it all was, how survival was just a matter of being in the right place at the right second, and how there was nothing you could do to control it. The crews developed various coping mechanisms to deal with the stress and trauma. Some became deeply religious, praying constantly and carrying religious tokens. Others became fatalistic, adopting an attitude of dark humor and reckless abandon, figuring they were dead anyway so they might as well enjoy what time they had left. Some, like Hans, simply went numb, shutting down their emotions and becoming mechanical in their responses. The battery had acquired a dog, a mutt that had wandered into the position and been adopted as a mascot. The men lavished affection on the animal, sharing their meager rations with it, and the dog seemed to provide a connection to normal life, to a world where there was still room for simple pleasures and uncomplicated relationships. When the dog was killed by a bomb fragment during a raid, grown men wept openly. By the summer of 1944, the situation had become almost surreal. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded, and German forces were in retreat on all fronts. The bombing of German cities intensified to levels that were almost incomprehensible. Raids that once involved 200 or 300 bombers now involved 1,000 or more. The sky would be black with aircraft, their contrails creating a lattice pattern against the blue sky, and the flak batteries would fire until their barrels glowed red hot and their ammunition was exhausted, and still the bombers came on. Hans had been at his battery for over a year now, which made him a veteran. Most of the original crew members he had known were dead or invalided out. He was now a gun commander himself, promoted because there was no one else left who had his experience. He was 18 years old. The faces of the new crew members who arrived seemed to get younger and younger. Hans found himself giving the same warnings and instructions that had been given to him, knowing that these boys were probably going to die, that their chances of surviving even a few months were slim. He tried not to learn their names, tried not to get attached, but it was impossible. They were just kids, scared and lost, looking to him for leadership because he was the veteran, the one who had survived. So he taught them everything he could, showed them how to take cover, how to load efficiently, how to recognize the sound of incoming bombs versus outgoing shells, how to control their fear well enough to function. And then he watched them die, one after another, as the raids continued relentlessly. The physical conditions at the battery deteriorated along with everything else. Food was scarce and of terrible quality. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Equipment that broke down often couldn't be repaired because replacement parts weren't available. The men were exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear because there was no opportunity for real rest. Hans developed a tremor in his hands that wouldn't go away, a constant fine shaking that made simple tasks difficult. His hearing was permanently damaged, a constant ringing in his ears that never stopped. He had chronic headaches from the repeated concussive blasts. His lungs felt heavy and congested from breathing in cordite smoke and dust. He was 18 years old and he felt like an old man. One of the worst aspects of serving in a flak battery was the sense of futility. Despite their efforts, despite the thousands of shells fired and the constant danger they endured, the bombers kept coming and the German cities kept burning. The crews could sometimes see the glow of fires on the horizon after a raid, could see the massive columns of smoke rising into the sky, and they knew that their defensive fire had not been enough. The cities they were trying to protect were being systematically destroyed, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. This sense of helplessness, of fighting a losing battle, was corrosive to morale. Some men questioned whether there was any point to continuing, whether they shouldn't just surrender or desert. But the penalties for such actions were severe, and there was always the propaganda about new wonder weapons that would turn the tide of the war, always the pressure to keep fighting, keep sacrificing, keep dying for the Reich. In the autumn of 1944, Hans's battery received a new commanding officer, a young SS lieutenant who was a true believer in National Socialism and who regarded the exhausted, traumatized crew members with contempt. He instituted harsh discipline, had men flogged for minor infractions, and shot a boy who fell asleep at his post. The atmosphere became one of terror, where the men feared their own officer almost as much as they feared the enemy bombers. Hans kept his head down and did his job, knowing that any sign of dissent or weakness could result in execution. The SS officer lasted 3 weeks before he was killed by a bomb fragment during a raid, and the entire battery breathed a sigh of relief. They went back to being led by their old sergeant, a practical man who understood that brutality toward your own men was counterproductive when those men were already being brutalized by the enemy. As winter approached again, the situation became increasingly desperate. The Allied armies were now on German soil, advancing from both east and west. The air raids were constant, around the clock, and the flak batteries were running out of ammunition. Sometimes they could only fire a few rounds during a raid before their magazines were empty. Hans watched a 1,000-bomber raid pass overhead with his guns silent because there were no shells left to fire. The impotence was maddening. They sat there in their positions, watching the bombers fly over in perfect formations, knowing that tons of bombs were about to fall on targets nearby, and there was nothing they could do about it. The casualties mounted remorselessly. Hans's battery was down to 2 guns now, manned by composite crews pulled together from survivors of other units. He knew most of these men were going to die, and he was probably going to die with them, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a cold stone. He stopped thinking about the future, because there probably wasn't going to be one. He lived moment to moment, hour to hour, focusing only on the immediate task of survival. When the sirens wailed, he went to his gun. When the bombers came, he fired. When the bombs fell, he took cover. When the raid ended, he helped with the wounded and the dead. Then he waited for the next raid. This was his existence, stripped of everything except the raw essentials of combat and survival. In December 1944, Hans was wounded for the first time. A bomb landed close enough that the concussion threw him against the gun shield, and he woke up in a field hospital with a concussion, broken ribs, and shrapnel wounds in his legs and back. The doctors told him he was lucky, that the wounds weren't serious, that he would recover. He was given 2 weeks to recuperate, and then sent back to his battery. When he arrived, he found that only one of the original 4 guns was still operational, and of the 40 men who had been in the battery when he first arrived, only 3 were still alive. Everyone else was dead, wounded, or had simply disappeared. The battery had been reinforced with old men and boys, Volkssturm militia members who had almost no training and often no proper uniforms. They were being thrown into combat because there was no one else left. The final months of the war were a nightmare of chaos and disintegration. Orders came and went, often contradicting each other. Supply lines collapsed. Communication broke down. The Flak batteries continued to fire at Allied aircraft because it was all they knew how to do, but everyone understood that the war was lost. The only question was how long the dying would continue. Hans's battery was ordered to relocate twice, hitching their remaining gun to a truck and moving to new positions, always retreating eastward, always trying to stay ahead of the advancing Allied armies. They set up in one location, fired at passing aircraft until their ammunition ran out or they were ordered to move again, then packed up and retreated further. It was exhausting and pointless, but they did it because the alternative was execution for desertion. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in from the east and American forces from the west, Hans's battery received its final orders. They were to hold their position and defend a bridge crossing over a small river. It was a suicide mission, everyone knew it, but the old sergeant gathered the remaining crew members and told them they would do their duty because they were soldiers, and that's what soldiers did. Hans, now 19 years old, looked at the faces around him. There were 12 men left, including himself. The youngest was 15, a boy named Klaus who had arrived 3 days earlier and barely knew how to load the gun. The oldest was 63, a man who had fought in the First World War and whose hands shook so badly from palsy that he could barely hold a rifle. This was what the German military had been reduced to, and they were expected to stop the combined might of the Allied armies. The Americans arrived the next morning, and the battle was short and brutal. The Flak gun got off perhaps 20 rounds before American artillery found their position and began pounding it with high explosive shells. Hans was in the ammunition bunker when the first shell hit the gun position directly, killing everyone at the gun in an instant. The second and third shells collapsed part of the bunker, burying 2 men alive. Hans and 3 others managed to claw their way out through a side entrance just as American infantry began advancing on the position. The old sergeant stood up with his hands raised in surrender, and an American soldier shot him in the chest. Whether it was intentional or accidental, Hans never knew. But the old man fell dead, and Hans threw down his weapon and put his hands over his head as high as they would go, and he screamed, "Kamerad! Kamerad!" until his voice was hoarse. The Americans took them prisoner, 4 teenage boys and 1 old man, the last survivors of the battery. They were searched, had their personal belongings confiscated, and were herded into a truck with prisoners from other units. Hans sat in the back of that truck, his hands still shaking, his ears still ringing, and he felt nothing. No relief at having survived, no grief for the dead, no hope for the future, just a vast emptiness. a numbness that went all the way down to his soul. The war was over for him, but in many ways, the war would never be over. The things he had seen, the things he had experienced, had changed him in fundamental ways that could never be undone. The stories of flak crews in World War II are stories of young men, many still children, who were thrown into a meat grinder and ground to pieces. They were given impossible missions, inadequate equipment, insufficient training, and expected to fight to the death against overwhelming odds. They experienced the terror of aerial bombardment while simultaneously trying to shoot down the aircraft bombing them. They watched their friends and comrades die in horrible ways, watched cities burn, watched the world around them disintegrate into chaos and ruin. And when the war was over, they were largely forgotten, their sacrifices dismissed or ignored because they had fought for the losing side, for a regime that history rightly condemns. But these young men were not the regime. They were not the architects of the war or the perpetrators of the Holocaust. They were teenagers and old men who found themselves caught up in a catastrophic conflict not of their making, who were ordered to fight and threatened with death if they refused. Their experiences deserve to be remembered, not to glorify war or to absolve Nazi Germany of its crimes, but to serve as a testament to the human cost of conflict, to the way war consumes young lives and destroys innocence. The boys who manned the flak guns didn't choose to be there. They were conscripted, coerced, threatened, and brutalized by their own side, even as they faced destruction from the enemy. They deserve to be mourned as victims of war, even as we condemn the cause they were forced to serve. Hans survived the war. He spent 2 years in an American prisoner of war camp before being released to return to a Germany that no longer existed. His hometown had been bombed into rubble. His mother was dead, killed in an air raid. His father never returned from the Eastern Front, presumably killed or dying in a Soviet prison camp. Hans had no home, no family, no prospects. He lived rough for several years, doing odd jobs, slowly building a new life from nothing. He married, had children, worked as a mechanic, and never spoke about his time in the flak battery. When his children asked about the war, he would change the subject. The nightmares plagued him for decades, dreams of bombs falling and guns firing and friends dying. The tremor in his hands never went away. The ringing in his ears persisted until the day he died. He lived to be 78 years old, dying in 2006. But part of him never left that gun position, never stopped loading those shells, never stopped hearing the sound of bombers overhead. There were hundreds of thousands of young men like Hans, serving in flak batteries across Germany and occupied Europe, manning the guns in Berlin and Hamburg, in the Ruhr and in Vienna, on the Atlantic Wall, and in the defense of the Reich itself. Some survived, many did not. Their story is one of the forgotten horrors of World War II, a nightmare that played out beneath the contrails of bombers and the black puffs of exploding shells. They were children thrown into an adult war, asked to perform impossible tasks under terrifying conditions, and when they died without glory, without recognition, without their sacrifice meaning anything, because the cause they served was already doomed. The flak crews were victims of a monstrous regime that consumed its own young in a futile attempt to stave off inevitable defeat. They were victims of a war that should never have been fought, that brought nothing but death and destruction to millions. And they were victims of the simple, terrible fact that in modern war, there are no safe positions, no rear areas that are truly secure. The boys who manned those guns were on the front lines just as surely as the infantry in the trenches, facing death with every raid, knowing that survival was a matter of luck rather than skill or courage. When we think about World War II, we tend to focus on the dramatic narratives, the heroic battles, the clear moral lines between good and evil. But the reality was infinitely more complex and painful. The reality included 16-year-old boys with bleeding hands loading shells into guns while bombs fell around them. It included old men dragged from retirement to die in defense of a regime they might not have even supported. It included the steady erosion of humanity under the relentless pressure of combat, the transformation of young men into traumatized shells of themselves. The Flak crews experienced all of this, and their story is a reminder that war, even a necessary war against a truly evil regime, creates victims on all sides, that suffering is not distributed according to moral desert, that innocence is no protection against violence. The statistics tell part of the story. Over 50,000 Flak crew members killed, hundreds of thousands wounded, countless others psychologically scarred for life, cities reduced to rubble despite their best efforts, a generation of young men destroyed, their potential unrealized, their lives cut short or permanently damaged. But statistics cannot capture the individual experiences, the fear and pain and grief, the moments of terror and the long stretches of exhausting labor, the relationships formed and broken, the humanity that persisted even in the midst of inhumanity. As we remember World War II, as we mark the anniversaries and tell the stories, we must not forget the Flak crews and others like them who were caught in the machinery of war and crushed by it. Their story is not a comfortable one because it complicates our narratives and challenges our assumptions. It forces us to confront the reality that war destroys indiscriminately, that the young and innocent suffer alongside the guilty, that trauma and death do not wait for moral clarity. The boys who manned the Flak guns were not heroes, but they were not villains either. They were casualties of a conflict that consumed them utterly, and their suffering was real and terrible regardless of the flag they served under. The legacy of the Flak crews is preserved in scattered memoirs, in archive photographs showing young faces staring at the camera with hollow eyes, in the testimony of survivors like Hans who eventually, late in life, found the courage to speak about their experiences. It lives on in the descendants of these men, who grew up wondering why their fathers or grandfathers flinched at loud noises, why they couldn't celebrate fireworks displays, why they kept their wartime experiences locked away in silence. It persists in the ruins of gun positions that still dot the European landscape, concrete foundations and rusted metal slowly being reclaimed by nature, silent monuments to a horror that most people have forgotten. Understanding the experience of Flak crews doesn't excuse the regime they served, or minimize the suffering of those who were victimized by Nazi Germany. Rather, it deepens our understanding of war's true cost, of how conflicts consume the young and innocent, of how trauma ripples across generations. These were boys who should have been in school, learning trades, falling in love, building futures. Instead, they were manning anti-aircraft guns, watching their friends die, and being slowly destroyed by experiences that no human being should have to endure. Their story is a tragedy, one of millions spawned by World War II, and it deserves to be remembered as a warning about the true nature of war. The next time you see historical footage of Flak bursts in the sky, those black puffs of smoke exploding around bomber formations, remember that each burst represents a gun crew on the ground, young men and boys working frantically to load and fire, exposed to counterattack, living in constant fear, dying in terrible ways when bombs found their positions. Remember that those crews were not abstractions or statistics, but human beings with names and faces and families who suffered and died in a war that ground up an entire generation. Remember Hans and the countless others like him, and let their story stand as testimony to war's ability to destroy everyone it touches, regardless of which side they're on. Let their suffering remind us of the true cost of conflict, and let that knowledge make us more reluctant to send another generation of young people into the meat grinder of war. That is the lesson of the Flak crews, written in blood and trauma across the skies of Europe, and it is a lesson we cannot afford to forget.